most mangas in this day and age gets a single anime adaptation, and if it fails, the franchise is mostly dead. However, The Flowers of Evil is a rare anomaly, being adapted into 3 different styles or mediums over the years. Hi, welcome to the show, it's AlienCraft, and today we are checking out my favorite manga, Flowers of Evil. The madness of this manga was written by the brilliant mangaka Oshimi Shuzo, who had been praised by the manga community for his masterful psychological horror stories, with many of his works rivaling big names such as Oyasumi Punpun and the horrifying stories of Junji Ito. At its core, The Flowers of Evil follows Takao Kasuga, a book-obsessed school student. However, his world was shattered when he was caught stealing his crush's gym clothes. But it gets worse. This introduces the next main character, Sawa Nakamura, the class outcast who secretly witnessed the whole thing. And instead of reporting him, Nakamura forces Kasuga into a twisted psychological contract, blackmailing him into acts of rebellion and self-destruction that strips away their facades, exposing the raw, ugly and terrifying real nature of teenage isolation. Before I begin, I would like to warn you that this video has major spoiler warnings, and if you haven't experienced the story yet, I highly implore you to go read the manga first. And without further delay, let's get right into it. To understand why directors kept trying to readapt the story, we have to start where the on-screen journey began, the infamous 2013 anime directed by Hiroshi Nagahama. At first, the fans were met with a slap to the face. The director made the wild, creative decision to shoot the entire show in live action first, and then completely trace over the footage using a technique called rotoscoping. The backlash was immediate and ruthless. People called it ugly, cheap, and a total insult to the original artwork. But if you look past the initial shock value, you start to realize something brilliant. The ugliness was actually the entire point. The director wasn't trying to make a standard pretty anime, he was trying to capture the exact feeling of psychological horror. In a medium dominated by stylized animes, the rotoscoping introduced an uncanny realism to it. The characters looked like actual awkward, deeply flawed teenagers trapped in this town. The rotoscoping was definitely the greatest highlight, as it was best shown during the iconic classroom scene in episode 7. And instead of using a fast-paced soundtrack for a moment of manic insanity, the director lets Hana by Asa-chan slowly creep into the background. As Kasuga and Nakamura vandalize their own classroom, the song staggered, a robotic percussion. Like a comment on YouTube had said, this song is like evil, trying to mix all these sounds together to create a beautiful song, but the instruments and sounds doesn't want to be put together by such a horrifying being, so they are scared and whispering screams for help. Yeah, maybe it's a bit far-reach, but what I'm trying to say is that it's freaking scary, my guy. It transforms an act of juvenile acts into a disturbing, almost ritual-like anthem. Beyond its visual and soundtracks, the pacing of the 2013 anime actually only adapts until chapter 20 of the manga. To put that into perspective, chapter 20 only concludes the first major turning point of the story, ending right after the devastating Hill incident. Stopping at chapter 20 means that the anime leaves the story completely unresolved, ending on a massive cliffhanger that cuts off before the manga's second half even begins. It treats the beginning of the story not as a prologue but as a completely psychological horror movie, and it's precisely this incomplete, localized adaptation that left the door wide open for future directors to step in years later and to try and capture the full scope of the full narrative. The next attempt in the timeline wouldn't come until 6 years later. But there is a question. Why was there such a heavy push for the movie in 2019? Since the anime wasn't well received by the fans, so why? The answer is actually quite simple. The 2013 anime left fans completely hanging by stopping at chapter 20. and the manga fans desperately wanted to see the true, definitive conclusion of the story brought to the TV screens. The production team rushed into production to fulfill the promise that long awaited the fans. First, they brought in the legendary Noboru Iguchi. If you know Iguchi, he is quite famous for directing deeply dark eccentric films like Machine Girl, making him the perfect psychological fit to handle the flowers of evil. Second, they absolutely nailed the casting. They landed the iconic model and actress Tina Tamashiro, who you might recognize in Alice in Borderland. She didn't just play the role, she completely embodies it. She captured Nakamura's cold, piercing glare and her sudden manic outbursts, and definitely her eccentric personality. But the biggest selling point of the 2019 film? It actually successfully covers the entire Flowers of Evil story. For the first time ever, fans actually got to see the second half of the manga adapted onto the screens, moving past the middle school drama and diving straight into the heavy redemption of Kasuga later into the story, delivering a complete storytelling of the manga in one sitting. I also love some of the creative choices that were brought here. Like, for example, Nakamura was chasing Kasuga on the bike, which was actually quite funny and bizarre, that actually pulled me away the first time I saw it. Another would be the iconic festival scene. I felt like it was a real emotional impact that had actual repercussions. I know we haven't delved into the show yet, but to be frank, I love the festival scene here because it felt dreadful, and the actions of Nakamura felt sincere and oddly guilty. So, was it successful? Critically and visually, it was a massive triumph. It gave the fans a gorgeous cinematic and incredibly faithful live-action adaptation that fixed the visual backlash of the Rotoscoped Anime. But structurally, it ran into a fatal flaw: time. A major reason for this rushed feeling is how the movie structurally handles the timeline. The film actually starts during the second half of the manga, treating the iconic middle school incidents as the past. Because of this, it actually forces two completely different story arcs to run at the same time. For viewers who haven't seen the manga, this structural choice makes the plot incredibly difficult to follow. It could pull you away from the immersive psychological breakdown, meaning you almost have to read the manga beforehand just to understand the context of what's happening on the screen. Trying to compress a massive deep psychological manga into a standard 2-hour runtime meant the pacing had to be moved at a rushed speed. It was a beautiful, highly commendable attempt, but by sprinting through the narrative milestones, it proved that 2 hours simply isn't enough to let the psychological horror of Flowers of Evil truly breathe. This finally brings us to the 2026 TV show, and right from the opening, the director drops a massive bombshell that was never once specified in the manga, anime, nor the movie. The entire story takes place in the year 1998. For the first time ever, the Flowers of Evil is explicitly locked into a fixed timeline. Does it change the plot? No. But aesthetically wise, it changes everything. It perfectly redefines the entire vibe of the show, taking the audience into the late 90s existential dread. It also pretty much justifies why these kids are running around the town all the time, whilst also using their flip phones instead of mobile phones. Personally, it's the small, deliberate, creative choices like this that makes me absolutely love media adaptations. Spanning over 13 episodes just like the original anime, this adaptation was finally able to wrap up the story in a coherent, non-rushed manner. However, comparing it to the fast-paced 2019 movie would be like comparing apples and oranges. They are simply two completely different, iconic pieces of media that highlight different strengths when done right. For instance, the TV show cast the iconic idol and songwriter Ano-chan for the role of Nakamura. And Ano-chan actually created the show's weirdly catchy, upbeat opening theme song. Due to this casting, fans of the idol were uproaring to witness the acting of Ano-chan. I should also mention that this series marks the return of Noboru Iguchi, the director for the 2019 film. But this time around, he isn't working alone. He is co-directing alongside Paul Young, who you might recognize for his works on Star Wars Visions? Yeah, talk about a massive departure in tone. With all that being said, the 2026 TV show is by far the most faithful adaptation to the manga, to the point where some shots are actual direct one-to-one recreations of the panels from the manga. It's amazing how much cinematography and color grading have improved since the live-action movie. Giving the story a 13-episode format, which accumulates to about 4 hours and 30 minutes, is a massive upgrade from the strict 2-hour duration of the movie. Thanks to this, the narrative succeeds to deliver a completely coherent storyline that accurately mirrors the manga. However, some fascinating creative choices were still put into play here. Despite being a nearly flawless translation of the source material, a few key scenes were altered. For example, take the middle of the story. In the manga, we see Kasuga and Nakamura inside their sinister cardboard tent, plotting their chaotic ideas right before the summer festival. The dark mood is abruptly broken when Nakamura pulls out a beer she stole from her house, forces Kasuga to drink it, laughs at him, and suddenly starts beating him up. It's an incredibly erratic odd action by Nakamura, and honestly one I'll love to break it down in a completely separate video. Anyways, in the 2026 TV adaptation, the beer was replaced with garlic chips? Yeah, and instead of physically forcing him to eat them or punching him, she just blows her sour breath into his face and laughs.
Excuse me, sir. I hope my horrible ugliness won't be a distraction to you.
Not at all, boy!
Why was this change made? I'm not quite sure, but it's a bizarrely interesting take nonetheless, and it offers yet another amazing interpretation of what this TV show has to offer. So how do you fix a masterpiece that refuses to be adapted? Because for the last 10 minutes I've been exemplifying of how each director took a creative liberty on the manga, and that's a tiny problem. After looking at the Rotoscoped Anime, a rushed 2-hour cinematic experience, and a beautifully polished 1998 TV drama, the answer becomes glaringly obvious. Every single director failed to fix Flowers of Evil because it was never actually gonna be perfect, and that's the beauty of it. Shuzo Oshimi didn't write a clean, comfortable story. He wrote a manga built entirely on the raw, suffocating and disturbing realities of isolation and guilt. When Hiroshi Nagahama made the 2013 anime ugly, he wasn't ruining the art, he was capturing the brutal realities of the manga. When Noboru Iguchi brought it to film, or when he teamed up with Paul Young to ground it into the isolation of the late 90s, they weren't trying to replace the manga, they were trying to show that not all things will be perfect. Each adaptation is a different creative team trying to interpret the beautiful madness of the Flowers of Evil. They didn't want to replace the source material, instead their failures and their creative swings gave us 3 completely unique takes into this psychological horror story. The Flowers of Evil remains an unadaptable anomaly, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you so much for watching. It's been Aidencraft, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that subscribe button and of course follow my Instagram page. See ya!